Sometimes we feel angry, and sometimes we feel super worried and anxious, and sometimes we're really self-critical. And when we do this, sometimes we just beat ourselves up for feeling this way because we're supposed to be happy. Well, today's episode is quite a relief. We are talking with neuroscientist Alex Korb about how your brain is wired and why being angry, feeling anxious and worried, and being self-critical is just the way your brain works, and there's nothing wrong with you at all. So excited to share this great news with you and then what we can do to feel happier as well. See you soon.
Here's your host, Matt O'Neill.
Your book, The Upward Spiral, that book was such a great book. And for anyone who hasn't read The Upward Spiral, can you describe the premise of the book?
Yeah. It's about what's happening in the brain in depression and what you can do about it. And I focused on depression because that's what my graduate research was on. But what I realized is there's nothing technically wrong with the brain in depression or broken with the brain in depression. There are these are the principles that guide the brain and why we sometimes get stuck in periods of, feeling like there's no point or lack of meaning or, fatigue or guilt or shame or overwhelm or stress. And there are just some aspects of that come with having a human brain. And it's helpful to know this is just how the brain works. There's not something wrong with me or broken about me. And that's an important first part of it, is just sort of understanding how your brain actually functions. And then the second part is about, hey, here are all the little things that you can do that science has shown affect the activity and chemistry of these key brain circuits, like physical activity or sunlight.
Before we get into what we can do about it, this was a really important thing for me to understand, was that nothing was wrong with me. That sometimes my brain does things and it's just I'm just a normal human. So for the person listening to the show that thinks there might be something wrong with them because their brain does certain things, what are some of the things the brain does where we can say, hey, what's wrong with me?
Yeah. So things like worry. Why do I worry so much? Well, worry is thinking about potential problems so that you could then potentially avoid them. Worry is actually using one of the most advanced pieces of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, which we evolved in order to think through things so we could project ourselves into the future and think oh no, I wouldn't want to do that. That might cause this. Think about how we're able to play chess. I could move here. Oh, but then he would move there. And that is engaging the same circuitry involved in worrying. So worrying is very helpful.
Yeah, this morning, the thought on my mind was I was being really hard on myself, and I was ruminating over an interview I had yesterday with Benjamin Hardy, who's one of my favorite authors. And he was interviewing me to potentially put my story in his upcoming book. And as I was getting my coffee ready, just my mind was worrying that I hadn't expressed my story in the right way. And I was just thinking that I had done a really bad job, and I was beating myself up. And then as I grabbed my cup of coffee, I'm like, man, I'm being really hard on myself. I'm being pretty negative. And then it ended up being helpful because I was like, oh, I actually missed 5 different bullet points that if he is going to put me in his book, I think would really enhance the story. And so I've got my little note right here. I put notes in my pocket of what to do when I have inspirations like this. And so the worry allowed me to then take action and write a bullet point list to him so that I could get some of the things I wished I had said in that interview into his hands. So yeah, sometimes our brain does beat us up and is like thinking about what went wrong.
Like the worry also, like worry is generally thinking about like things that could go wrong in the future. And then often,
that was more like beating myself up about the past, but also worried that I wouldn't get in the book.
Yeah. Because and often we like get stuck going everything that could go wrong in the future. And then we're thinking about everything that happened wrong in the past. And we're going back and forth and like missing out on the opportunity to live our lives, which is where sometimes worry and self-criticism can unfortunately lead if they get programmed in a particular way. But worry in itself isn't a problem. Same with self-criticism. The brain wants to have control over the world. And self-criticism, like, oh, I should have done that, helps us feel more in control over the world and often can remind us of like, well, I can't go back in the past and change that. But because I'm mad at myself now, it motivates me to take action and change my behavior so it doesn't keep happening again and again. So
there's nothing wrong with me that I woke up beating myself up about the conversation I had yesterday. And I'm saying this because there's nothing wrong with you if you're listening to this, to Alex and I talk about this. If you find yourself beating yourself up about saying something you think was silly or inappropriate, or you just happen to do the thing that you felt embarrassed by, our brain is going to present this to us. And you're not a negative person. It's just its job. It's doing its job.
Yeah. And it is hard sometimes because you might be a negative person in that like different people's brains are different. And some people worry more, some people worry less. Some people are more self-critical. Some people are less self-critical. But where we run into trouble is when we're like, oh, I wish I had that guy's brain. He just moves past everything. And it's like, well, any individual circuit you have, like that's not where all of your problems are. It's the combination of all of these different circuits and how they're interacting with each other. Some of those you can change by reprogramming your habits, for example. Some of them you can't change. Like some people their brains will just are more reactive to negative information and that the possible things that could go wrong. There's nothing inherently worse about that. There's this classic example of like in positive psychology where like you don't want an optimistic engineer building your bridge or your building. You don't want an optimistic pilot. It's like, oh yeah, I think I can land this plane. Like you want them to be thinking
about the critical thinking one,
the things that could go wrong.
Yeah, and every team needs that critic in their inner circle to see what could go wrong. So my wife is a worrier. Her signature thought pattern is what could go wrong.
Right.
And it's not the way my brain works at all. It's just not the way it works. But she is so vigilant that about any potential thing that could threaten us. Like last night, that we've got this stray cat. And the stray cat has come up to our house the last 2 nights. The first night I saw it, I brought tuna fish out. And I was like, heck yeah, we got a stray cat. You know, my daughter really wants a cat. We don't have a cat. We got dogs. Last night, the stray cat comes back. We've named it Tiger. And now I've got cat food because I'm like waiting for Tiger to come back. And so we're out there feeding Tiger, petting her. You know, the kids are having a blast. And Katie's inside looking on her phone about the diseases stray cats can carry. And she's like, if it scratches you, if it bites you, like we could get this, we could get this, we could get this. And I'm like, that's all super useful to know. Like I'm just having fun with the cat. She's protecting our kids from whatever disease that they could get. So it's useful. Now, on the flip side, my brain is wired to get angry when I feel threatened. And Katie's brain is not wired that way at all. So if she feels threatened, she doesn't go directly to like getting frustrated or angry. She's trying to avoid the conflict and just kind of move past it, where I will just confront it.
Right.
And so completely different. Both of them, like neither's good nor bad. It's just I am differently wired mentally.
Right. Well, I think it's helpful. There are a few different analogies it reminds me of. One is it's sort of like basketball players. Like there's 5 players on a team. I've been watching March Madness lately, the men's and the women's brackets, really exciting. But like, well, some of the players, they're like really tall and they can practically just stick the ball in. And other players, they're kind of short, like they're almost as short as me. Some of the women's that play are shorter than me, and they're amazing at ball handling and shooting. Like, why don't they just all have just the tall people? Well, because the team wouldn't work that well. And so what you cannot change about yourself is, say, your height. But if you are short, stop trying to dunk the basketball over a 7-footer. Use what you are good at and develop those abilities, because it's not your height that is most limiting your ability to be good at basketball. It is your lack of accepting your limitations. Same, like I joke sometimes people are good at jumping. Like Michael Jordan could, he could dunk from the free throw line, but he didn't try to dunk from the 3-point line, because that would be ridiculous and absurd. So like, even if you have amazing abilities, like you have to know where the limits of those amazing abilities are. Otherwise, you'll create more problems. And Michael Jordan, I guarantee you, wasn't like, oh man, I sucked. I can't even dunk from the 3-point line. Like, no, like when you have abilities, unfortunately, we sometimes look at them and we focus on the limits and then only experience the frustration about it, as opposed to being able to appreciate all these abilities that we have. And the other thing that reminds me of is like a herd of animals. Like I remember visiting Africa one time, and you like drive past in a Jeep by, a herd of antelope or zebras or something. And like most of them ignore you and they just eat grass. But, a couple of them look up. And what I realized is like, oh, I am not a lion, so he doesn't have to worry about me. But nobody knows that until they look up. So the ones who look up, they're less likely to get eaten by a lion, because they're going to see it first and react faster. So who is better suited? Is it the one who's like eating grass and last to look up, or is it the one who looks up every time and therefore eats less grass? Well, it depends. How many lions are there? How much threat is in the environment? How fast are you? If you're the fastest zebra,
or you go ahead and get the zebra who looks up on your team.
Yeah.
And you get the zebra who's staying well fed on your team, and you create a good team with everybody's skills.
Yeah. And that's where
that's what Katie brings to our marriage too. This vigilance has helped us tremendously.
Exactly.
Right?
Because she, yes, has to deal with the burden of like, being
worry.
Slightly unhappy and worry, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you are more likely to get rabies and your kids infected with rabies, right? And
I am more likely to get my family infected with some type of stray cat disease.
And so like, that's where we need to realize, because the problem is when we judge other people, Be like, oh, you should be more like me. Or when we judge ourselves, like, I should be more like you, instead of appreciating like, oh, well, what, yeah, my tendencies of my biology, some of which I cannot change, are making certain things easier and other things harder. So I should at least appreciate what it is making easier. And if it's getting in the way of something that's really important to me, well, then is there something that I could change about my biology? You can't fundamentally change the kind of person that you are, just like you can't change your height. Oh, but maybe I could change how I am approaching the game of basketball and focus more on passing and shooting and things that utilize my natural abilities, instead of my natural abilities constantly feeling like they're getting in the way of my goals.
Yeah, and an example of this is that quick trigger of anger, which I don't know if I was born with it or learned it, probably both. And so when I was younger, I didn't have regulation over it, and somebody would do something that threatened me, and like I would get in fist fights on the basketball court. I played basketball. There'd be confrontation. Now, this wasn't really healthy. It wasn't great for my relationships. It wasn't great, for my emotions or moods. Or at work, somebody would, do something that I thought was threatening me, and then immediately I'd get angry and escalate the situation, and that wasn't helpful either. So, I've done a lot of work to say, all right, when I feel the sensations of anger coming on, my first reaction, the very first thing I need to do is stop. Take a deep breath, like create some space. The feeling is still there. Like my brain is wired to immediately want to fight. And yet I know that that's not most likely going to be the best course of action immediately when I feel threatened. So for me, I've learned the act of stopping and breathing and creating space before I make any type of reaction. And so, and if your brain is wired like mine is, that's a pretty good course of action to take. My goal now is to not have any reaction until I'm cool-headed.
Right.
So make the best choices then.
But so like those are some of the things you can't necessarily inherently change your brain's automatic reactivity. You can sometimes by, generally taking care of yourself. Oh, well, like if you got a good night's sleep, well, maybe it's not quite so reactive. Or if you have a few mindset shifts where, other people aren't trying to attack you, then it might make it less reactive. So there's some general things that maybe you can do, but like having a brain that is emotionally reactive is not a bad thing. What makes it a bad thing is the habits that you've programmed into it that are automatically triggered. Like if you feel that anger and then you act on it by punching someone and then it's problematic. But the fact that you have strong emotions when there's a perceived injustice, that in many ways can be used for good, because you're not going to put up with the BS or whatever, where someone else is like, what can you do? And they're just going to go along with it. But like your emotions are saying, hey, no, this is important, and it's prompting you to take action. And that is a good thing.
Yeah, action's a big part of my life, right? And so I take a tremendous amount of action. So again, using the basketball analogy, I'm using the strength that I have to the best of my ability.
Right.
So I know, as we were talking about the upward spiral, and it is understanding depression and then what we can do about it. So the first thing I wanted to do was have you explain that there's nothing wrong with you. If you worry or get anxious or you're quick to anger or sometimes you're self-critical, there's nothing wrong, that you're a human. But now let's talk about what can we do about it, because your book describes some just really simple everyday things we can do to make ourselves more of a positive, happy, well enjoyed person.
Yeah. So one of the simplest things is sort of along the lines of what we're saying is about those emotions, is to first recognize like, oh, this not something wrong with me, because a lot of times we have an emotion and then we immediately have this habitual thought of like, oh, I shouldn't be having that, or that's bad. And then we make it worse because now we have it and we're mad at ourselves for having it. And if you can just have an emotion and acknowledge and actually label it like, oh, I'm angry right now, that simple action allows the analytical prefrontal cortex, this evolved part of the brain, to automatically regulate and lower the amygdala's emotional reactivity. So the amygdala is one of the emotional centers of the brain. So it's just
for my
labeling
wife,
that emotion.
As my wife is feeling fearful or anxious, just labeling it and just calling it what it is. Hey, I can feel some anxiousness coming over me. Will start to reduce that reaction in her.
Right. And the only way that one of the main ways that goes wrong is when we start to become mindful and label those emotions. Well, then our habits kick in. It's like, oh, but I shouldn't be this worried. I've been practicing all these. Oh, and you just keep doing. Oh, I'm being worried that I'm worried, and that's okay. And like just being able to label the emotions. Another big part of that too is self-compassion. Like being able to label it. Oh, that's a moment of mindfulness. But then we have often habits of reacting to those emotions with self-criticism but we can replace that with a habit of self-compassion. Like, oh yeah, that's really frustrating. And you can sort of think of it as your ideal way to interact with like your kid. If your kid is scared about going to the dentist, you don't be like, well, stop being scared. There's nothing to be scared about. Like they are, okay, well, they are scared. They're trying to tell you about their feelings. And if you just ignore their feelings, well, okay, they're going to stop telling you about them. And then you're not going to be able to connect or help them. And that's often what happens in the brain as well. Like we have these emotions, and because we have so much self-criticism, our brain kind of is like, oh, well, if you're not going to be helpful or listen to me, then I'm going to stop telling you about these things. And then we become disconnected.
And you become kind of numb and emotionless. And of course, when I was a kid, my dad was like, men don't cry. Right. And so as a 5-year-old scraping my knee, I'm like, just shaking it off. And then my brain just shut down a lot of the signals of when I was actually hurting, not physically hurt, but hurting emotionally. And it's taken a lot of work to bring them back and to get reconnected to these emotions, which I really want to feel.
Yeah. And you expressed it only really through socially acceptable ways that like, oh, well, if men aren't allowed to cry, well, you had these emotions and your brain is like, I got to do something with them. And some part of your brain is like, oh, I know. When guys are really aggressive, people look up to them. Oh, great. I'll just be the most aggressive guy. And that was how your brain successfully figured out how to deal with these emotions. It just created other consequences and other problems. And that's why we often run into trouble, because the solutions that our brain came up with at a spur of the moment.
But I was only 5. And this is the thing. I was a 5-year-old kid.
Yeah.
And it's just, so if you're listening to this show, you probably made some decisions when you were a child.
And not necessarily consciously.
Said,
right.
And they could be running your whole life too. And so the downside to not being in touch with the sadness or the hurt is that I wasn't fully able to connect with other people when they were feeling hurt. And it's still something where my wife will still say, like, I can't tell you I'm feeling sick because you don't have any sympathy for me. And I'm like,
You'd be
man,
like, take some chicken soup, do this, do that, do that. Like,
yeah, right. I'm just like trying to fix it. I'm not really like trying to like hear that she's feeling, poorly. Or I'm like, man, it might just be in your head. She doesn't want to hear any of that. So that's not helpful. And it's ruining connection. But it's because I kind of shut down that you're weak thing. The weakness wasn't allowed to be something that was there. And so I'm working really hard to bring it back, to say, hey, it's okay to be vulnerable, so that I can be compassionate with other people when they feel vulnerable as well.
And that's ideally the kind of relationship you want to cultivate with yourself. Like, that's why, like, there are many other little habits and tidbits I could talk about. But just like that, the nature of that relationship, that conversation you're having with yourself is the most important piece, because, okay, you have emotions. So either you're just going to react habitually based on what's been programmed into your brain, given your DNA and your early childhood experiences and your environment. And sometimes that's not a problem to live on autopilot, as long as the autopilot is taking you where you want to go. But if at any point you're like, I have these emotions, they're triggering these habits. Well, I can't necessarily eliminate the emotions, nor do I want to, but I can maybe take some intentional steps in a different direction to start to program more positive habits.
So one of those positive habits was, and I quote you all the time, and it is from your book. You said you're going to be pretty hard pressed to find somebody who's training for a marathon who's feeling depressed. And I think about that all the time, because you said just the act of exercising to that degree every single day is going to release so many endorphins in the body and do so many positive things that it's just really hard to stay down when you're exercising. Why is exercise so important to our happiness?
Exercise, there's many different ways to answer the question, but one of them is from an evolutionary perspective. Like, our brains evolved in bodies that were moving around, and it functions best when you're moving. We didn't evolve to sit in front of a computer all day. On a more mechanistic level, it's because physical activity, whether it's formal exercise or not, physical activity helps lower the stress hormone cortisol in the long term, because sometimes it elevates it in the short term, just like your heart rate gets elevated in the short term, but continued exercise over time improves your heart health. So it's a complex dynamic thing, but it also boosts a lot of important neurotransmitter systems, like the serotonin system and the dopamine system, which are the same systems targeted by a lot of antidepressant medications. It changes the electrical activity of the brain while we're asleep, so that the sleep is more restful and restorative. So it has all these impacts.
We should exercise. And for the person listening to the show, what's the recommended amount and intensity, and what types of exercises help?
Yeah, well, it turns out it doesn't really matter what kind of exercise. People often are like, okay, but this many minutes of weightlifting and this many minutes of aerobic activity. The general guidelines are about 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity aerobic activity. But like, that exact amount is different for different people. Because your brain is not the same as everybody else's. So what really matters is if you're well below that, you don't need to make dramatic changes in your life. It just suggests like, oh, hey, well then probably if you got more physical activity, that would help you a lot. And if you're like, I don't have the time to exercise for 150 minutes a week, which is like 20 minutes a day, Okay, well, then just make one little small change. Like if you're sitting on the couch, well, if all you did was get up off the couch and walk around the block once for 5 minutes, well, that's a heck of a lot better than just sitting on the couch all day. So don't let the amount of exercise you can't do get in the way of doing the exercise that you can do.
I mean, when you say it like this, it's 2.5 hours. And we've got a lot of hours in the week. I don't remember the exact number. I think it's like 180 or 190 hours. We're talking about 2.5 of almost 200 hours.
There's actually an even easier
this
start.
Is 1%. It's like only 99% of our time we can be sedentary. And you're just saying just 1% of the time we need to be moving at a moderate pace.
I would say I would change that actually, because when we're talking about physical activity, and that's why I don't like to talk about exercise so much, because the word exercise has all these different meanings to different people and unhelpful connotations. The most important thing is actually not exercise at all. It's to avoid being sedentary.
Okay.
So sometimes people like, well, I don't understand. I work at a computer for 8 hours a day, or I sit in a chair for 8 hours a day, but then I go, for a 10-mile run on the weekends. It's like, the most important thing is avoiding long periods of being sedentary. And it really takes very little to avoid that. Like just every half hour, or at least every hour, like literally just stand up out of your chair, walk around for 10 seconds, and you could sit back down. And that would have a huge dramatic effect. So if you put it in that perspective, like, okay, 10 seconds every hour, it's like a tiny little fraction, but just doing little movements like that are very helpful. A lot of times people focus on the like intense exercise, which I don't have the energy for. So like sometimes more frequent light exercise is more helpful because you'll actually do it.
My sister goes for a walk every night. She just goes for a walk every night. And the other thing that she does is she walks outside.
Yeah.
It's not intense. It's just a walk.
Right.
And I think getting outside also is something that increases our happiness. So like I really honor and respect that she goes for this walk every night outside. And I think it's a super amazing happiness habit that she has. It can't be that easy, right? Couldn't we just walk? Couldn't we just go for a walk?
No, so a brisk walk counts as moderate intensity exercise. So I usually walk for 10 minutes in the morning after I drop my kids off at school. That also is, you're being out with some trees and nature and you're getting some sunlight. And that also has separate positive effects. But just the physical activity, then I usually go on another walk, in the afternoon. Okay. And if that's all I do, okay, well, that's good. But I was reading that if you bump up the intensity a little bit to say vigorous intensity activity, well, you only need 75 minutes of that vigorous activity a week to sort of meet that threshold of what the average person needs. So some people might need more, some people might need less. But that means if you are jogging at 5 miles per hour or more, that's a 12-minute mile or something. That counts as vigorous activity. So I think a lot of, goal-oriented people, what we think of is I have to be on the Peloton for an hour, for it to count as exercise. And then we're I don't have the energy for that. I'm not going to do anything. Well, it's okay, if you want to push yourself and you feel like you get more out of that, awesome, do it. And if you can't push yourself, well, then don't judge yourself for being weak. Just go for a walk at sunset and enjoy it.
Oh man, why don't we just enjoy our life? I think this is such great happiness advice, and we need a neuroscientist to teach us how to just enjoy our life. Like, if you don't feel like torturing yourself on the Peloton, go for a walk at sunset and enjoy it. I mean, is beautiful advice. And I know we're about to wrap up here. I know sleep is really important to you. It is one of the things you talk about. What are the other couple things, if we just had a couple things to focus on to improve our brain happiness, the way our brain functions to be happier?
So those like basic, simple life changes are like, physical activity and avoiding inactivity and sleep. And if you just do a lot of those things for a lot of people, okay, that's going to solve most of their problems. And like, even when it comes to sleep, it's not about sleeping more. It's about improving the quality of your sleep. So like, if you get a little sunlight in the morning, maybe because you're going on a walk in the morning, that's a 2-for-1. Like, you get some exercise and you set your circadian rhythm so that it's easier to fall asleep at night. So there are a lot of times it's like little tiny tweaks that can drastically improve the quality of your sleep, even if you don't have any more time to sleep longer. Other really powerful ones include things like gratitude, which is about focusing on the positive. But when I talk about gratitude, it's not about controlling your feelings in the moment. It's just about directing your attention to the parts of your life or reality that you're glad are there. So it's in the face of things you can't control, the only useful path forward is like acceptance or thinking about them in a different way, because it's easy to accept things that are positive, for example. But then for the things that are important to us that we actually have control over, those are the things that you should take action on. And being able to think and know which is the really key skill.
Well, if someone wants to reach out to you, get to know more about your work, understand how to identify what we can control and what is important to us, how would they get in touch?
Yeah, well, I have some free downloads on my website, alexkorbphd.com. And I post a lot on social media now, on Instagram and Facebook, Alex Korb PhD. So they can jump on my mailing list and get some of those resources for free, or join one of my coaching programs.
Man, thank you so much for bringing all of this neuroscience wisdom to our happiness program today. And Alex, I just appreciate you, man.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode with Matt O'Neill.